Jacob had agreed to this blind date out of desperation, not hope. A black single father drowning in grief and bills had no business looking for love. But when he walked into the restaurant and saw the woman at his reserved table, shoulders shaking, mascara streaming down her face, he knew something was wrong. Then she looked up and his blood ran cold. His CEO, the most powerful woman in his company. He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Can you pretend I'm not anyone important just for tonight? I'm so tired." Before we continue, let us know in the comment section where in the world you're tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And if this story speaks to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The morning had started like every other morning for the past 2 years. Jacob's alarm screamed at 5:30, and he dragged himself out of bed before his 6-year-old daughter could wake up to an empty kitchen. He scrambled eggs with one hand and packed her lunchbox with the other, moving through the motions like a man running on fumes. When Sophie finally stumbled down the hallway, rubbing sleep from her eyes, he knelt down and kissed her forehead. "Morning, baby girl. Eggs are ready." She climbed onto her chair, still half asleep, and Jacob watched her for a moment before glancing at the photograph on the counter. His wife Maya smiled back at him from behind the glass. She had been gone for 2 years now, taken by an illness that had moved faster than any doctor could fight. Some mornings, Jacob still reached for her side of the bed. Some mornings, he forgot she was gone. "Daddy, you're staring at Mommy again," Sophie said quietly. Jacob blinked and turned back to his daughter. "Just telling her good morning." He dropped Sophie off at school with 3 minutes to spare, then drove 20 minutes across town to the corporate tower where he had worked for the past 4 years. The building gleamed in the morning sun, all glass and steel and money. Jacob parked in the back lot where the lower-level employees kept their cars and walked through the service entrance. Nobody greeted him. Nobody ever did. He was one of hundreds of faceless workers in the operations department, a black man in a sea of white-collar ambition who had learned long ago that keeping his head down was the only way to survive. His direct supervisor, a man named Patterson, barely acknowledged his existence unless something went wrong. And when something went wrong, it was always Jacob's fault. That afternoon, his phone buzzed with a call from his mother. "Jacob, I need you to listen to me," she said, before he could even say hello. "You cannot keep living like this. You're exhausted. You're lonely. And that little girl needs more than a father who's running himself into the ground." Jacob leaned against the break room wall, rubbing his temples. "Mama, I don't have time for this." Or, "You don't have time to live? That's exactly my point." Her voice softened. "I set something up for you. A dinner, tonight. A friend of mine knows a woman who's looking to meet someone. Just one dinner, Jacob. That's all I'm asking." He wanted to say no. He wanted to explain that he had nothing left to give, that his heart had been buried alongside Maya, that the idea of sitting across from a stranger and pretending to be whole felt like a cruel joke. But his mother had that tone in her voice, the one that meant she had already made up her mind. "Fine," he said quietly. "One dinner." Across town in a corner office that overlooked the entire city, Ella Bennett stood at the window and watched the sun begin its descent. At 32 years old, she was the youngest CEO in the company's history, a position she had inherited when her father died 3 years ago. The board had doubted her. The shareholders had questioned her. And every single day since she had worked to prove them wrong. But proving them wrong came at a cost. The phone on her desk lit up and she saw her aunt's name on the screen. She considered ignoring it, but family was the one thing she could never escape. "Ella, darling, I'm calling to remind you about tonight." Ella closed her eyes. "I haven't forgotten." "Good. Because you're 32 years old and money doesn't keep you warm at night." Her aunt's voice carried the weight of a woman who had watched her niece grow up alone. "Just meet him? One dinner? What's the worst that could happen?" Ella almost laughed. She had spent her entire adult life watching people approach her with calculated smiles and hidden agendas. Men who saw her bank account before they saw her face. Women who pretended to be friends until they needed a favor. She had stopped believing in genuine connection years ago. "I'll go," she said flatly. "But don't expect a miracle." The restaurant was one of those upscale places where the menus didn't have prices, and the waiters spoke in hushed tones. Jacob arrived 15 minutes early, wearing a suit he had bought for Maya's funeral and hadn't touched since. It still fit, but barely. He tugged at the collar as he approached the hostess stand, painfully aware that he didn't belong here. "Reservation for Mitchell," he said. The hostess smiled politely and led him to a table near the back. And that's when he saw her. A woman sat alone at the table, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders trembled, and even from a distance Jacob could hear the quiet, broken sounds of someone crying. His first instinct was to turn around. This wasn't his problem. He had enough problems of his own. But something in the way she sat there so completely alone in a room full of people pretending not to notice made him hesitate. He approached slowly, and when he reached the table, he cleared his throat gently. She looked up. For a moment, neither of them moved. Mascara streaked down her cheeks like dark rivers, and her eyes were red and swollen. But even through the mess of tears and smeared makeup, Jacob recognized her instantly. He had seen that face on company emails, on the massive portrait hanging in the lobby on the screen during quarterly meetings he was never important enough to attend. Ella Bennett, his CEO, the woman who held his career in her hands without even knowing his name. Every instinct told him to leave, to apologize for the interruption, to walk out of the restaurant, to pretend this had never happened. Getting involved with someone this powerful could only end in disaster. He was nobody. She was everything. And whatever was happening to her right now, it was none of his business. He turned to go. "Wait!" Her voice stopped him. It was small, nothing like the commanding tone she used in boardrooms. She looked up at him with an expression he hadn't expected, something raw and desperate. "Can you pretend I'm not anyone important? Just for tonight. I'm so tired." Jacob stood frozen. He thought about Sophie, about his job, about all the reasons this was a terrible idea. Then he thought about something else. He thought about the nights after Maya died, when he had sat alone in their empty bedroom and wished someone, anyone, would just sit with him. Not to fix anything, not to offer advice, just to be there. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "I don't know who you are," he said quietly. "And you don't know me. So I guess that makes us even." Ella stared at him. She had expected him to run. Everyone always ran either away from her power or toward it. Nobody ever just stayed. "You're not afraid of me?" she asked. Jacob met her eyes. "Should I be?" For the first time that evening, something flickered across her face. Not quite a smile, but close. Like the first crack of light breaking through a storm cloud. "I don't know," she admitted. "Everyone else is." Jacob leaned back in his chair, studying the woman in front of him. Behind the expensive clothes and the tear-stained face, he saw something familiar. Exhaustion. Loneliness. The weight of carrying more than any one person should have to carry alone. "Well," he said, "I'm not everyone else." And for reasons neither of them could explain, she believed him. The waiter appeared, and Ella quickly wiped her face with a napkin, trying to compose herself. She ordered a glass of wine. Jacob asked for water. When the waiter left, an uncomfortable silence settled between them, thick and heavy with everything neither of them knew how to say. Jacob shifted in his seat. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This woman signed his paychecks. One wrong word, one misunderstanding, and his career could be over. But when he looked at her, really looked at her, he didn't see the CEO who commanded boardrooms and made executives tremble. He saw a woman who had been crying alone in a crowded restaurant, waiting for someone who probably wasn't going to show up. "So," he said carefully, "rough day." Ella let out a laugh that held no humor. "You could say that." She straightened her posture, and Jacob watched her try to rebuild the walls he had just seen crumble. Her voice became more controlled, more measured. The CEO was trying to resurface. "What department do you work in?" she asked. "Operations. 4th floor." "How long?" "4 years." She nodded as if cataloging the information. Jacob recognized the deflection. She was trying to make this a business interaction, something she could control, but he hadn't sat down for a job interview. "Why were you crying?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Ella's composure flickered, and for a moment Jacob thought she might shut down entirely. But then her shoulders dropped, and the mask slipped again. "Today is my birthday." Jacob blinked. "Your birthday." She nodded slowly. "I received 47 messages this morning. 47, and every single one of them came with something attached. A contract that needed signing, a favor someone needed, an invitation to a fundraiser where they wanted me to write a check." She looked down at her hands. "I have never, not once in my adult life, been wished a happy birthday by someone who didn't want something from me." The words hung in the air. Jacob thought about his own birthdays, about Maya baking him crooked cakes, and Sophie making him cards with too much glitter. He thought about how, even in the hardest years, he had always had someone who loved him just for being him. "Happy birthday," he said quietly. Ella looked up at him, and her eyes glistened. "You're not going to ask for anything?" Jacob shrugged. "I'd offer to buy you dinner, but I'm guessing you've already paid for this place." She stared at him for a long moment, and then something unexpected happened. She laughed. It was small and surprised, like she hadn't expected the sound to come out of her own mouth. But it was real, and Jacob felt something shift between them. "You're strange," she said. "I've been called worse." The wine arrived, and Ella took a long sip. The tension in her shoulders began to ease, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Tell me something about yourself. Something real." Jacob considered the question. He could give her the surface version, the version he gave everyone. But she had just shown him her wounds. The least he could do was show her one of his. "My wife passed away 2 years ago," he said. "Cancer. She fought hard, but it moved faster than anyone expected. She left behind me and our daughter Sophie. She was 4 when it happened." Ella's expression changed. Not pity, which he had seen too many times, and had learned to hate. Something closer to recognition. "I'm sorry," she said. "The first year was the hardest. I didn't know how to be a father without her. I didn't know how to be anything without her." He traced his finger along the edge of his water glass. "But every morning Sophie would come into my room and say, 'Daddy, wake up.' And I would, because she needed me to. That's the only reason I'm still standing." Ella was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My father died 3 years ago. Heart attack. No warning. One day he was running the company, and the next day he was gone." She swirled the wine in her glass. "My mother left when I was 7. I barely remember her face. So when my father died, I inherited everything. The company, the board, the expectations. I was 29 years old, and suddenly I was responsible for thousands of employees and billions of dollars." Jacob listened without interrupting. "Everyone thinks I'm powerful," she continued. "They see the office, the title, the money. But do you want to know the truth? I'm just an orphan who's been pretending she knows what she's doing. Every single day I walk into that building terrified that today is the day everyone figures out I'm a fraud." The confession hung between them, raw and unguarded. Jacob looked at this woman who owned half the city and saw someone just as broken as he was, just as tired, just as alone. "Maybe we're more alike than I thought," he said. Ella met his eyes, and something passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but understanding. The recognition of 2 wounded people who had finally found someone who didn't look away. They talked for another 2 hours, about small things and big things, about Sophie's obsession with dinosaurs and Ella's secret love of old black-and-white movies. About the pressure of being judged by the color of your skin and the weight of being judged by the size of your bank account. By the time the restaurant began to empty, Jacob realized he hadn't felt this light in years. When they finally stood to leave, Ella hesitated. "What happened tonight?" she said carefully. "Can it just be tonight?" Jacob understood. She was scared of what this could become, scared of what it could cost. He nodded. Tonight never happened. She gave him a small, grateful smile, and then she was gone, disappearing into a black car that had been waiting at the curb. Jacob drove home in silence. When he walked through the front door, he found Sophie asleep on the couch, the babysitter watching television. He paid her, carried his daughter to her bed, and sat beside her for a long time, just watching her breathe. Something inside him had shifted. Something he had thought was dead had begun to stir, and he didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified. Across town, Ella entered her penthouse. The silence was deafening, as it always was. She kicked off her heels, walked to the window, and looked out at the city lights. For the first time in months, she didn't feel completely alone. That night, she slept without dreaming. The next morning, Jacob arrived at work with his heart pounding. He didn't know what to expect. Part of him hoped he would see her. Part of him hoped he wouldn't. At 9:15, the elevator doors opened and Ella stepped out. She was transformed. Gone was the vulnerable woman from the restaurant. In her place stood the CEO, ice-cold and untouchable, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she strode toward the executive wing. She passed within 10 feet of Jacob. She didn't look at him once. Jacob felt something sink in his chest. Of course. What had he expected last night was a moment of weakness for her, nothing more. He was nobody. She was everything. The fantasy was over before it had even begun. He threw himself into his work trying to forget. But at 3:17 that afternoon, an email appeared in his inbox. Internal server. No subject line. From N. Bennett. He opened it with trembling fingers. "Thank you for last night. I still remember. N." Over the following weeks, Ella found ways to see him. Brief encounters in empty hallways, a shared elevator ride that lasted 30 seconds too long, a coffee delivered to his desk with no note, just the way he had mentioned he liked it. They were careful, always careful. Two people dancing around something neither of them was ready to name. During one of their stolen conversations, Ella mentioned that she had been reviewing departmental reports and had noticed something interesting. "Your performance metrics are among the highest in your division," she said. "You've submitted 3 proposals in the past 2 years that were rejected without review. I looked at them. They were good. Better than good." Jacob shifted uncomfortably. "It's fine. I'm used to it." "You shouldn't have to be used to it." Her voice carried an edge of frustration. "You're being wasted in that position. I could move you somewhere where your work would actually be recognized." "No." The word came out sharper than he intended. He softened his tone. "I appreciate it. I do. But I don't want people to think I got ahead because of whatever this is between us. I need to earn it myself, or it means nothing." Ella looked at him with something between admiration and frustration. "You're the most stubborn man I've ever met. Stubborn runs in my family." She smiled despite herself, and Jacob felt his heart twist. Then came the day everything changed. Sophie's school called at 10 in the morning. Her teacher had fallen ill, and there was no one to watch the class. Jacob had no choice. He picked up his daughter and brought her to the office, praying he could keep her hidden until the end of the day. He almost succeeded. At 2:45, Sophie escaped while he was in a meeting. He found her 20 minutes later standing in the executive hallway face to face with Ella Bennett. His blood ran cold. But Ella wasn't angry. She was kneeling on the marble floor, her designer dress pooling around her, her eyes level with Sophie's. "Are you a princess?" Sophie was asking. "Daddy says there's a princess who rules this whole building." Ella's expression was soft in a way Jacob had never seen before. "I'm not a princess. I'm just someone trying really hard not to mess everything up." Sophie tilted her head. "My daddy says that too." Something broke open in Ella's face. She looked up at Jacob, and in that moment he saw everything she had been trying to hide: the loneliness, the longing, the terrifying realization that she was falling in love with him. He saw it because he felt it too. But before either of them could speak, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Patterson Jacob's supervisor rounded the corner and froze. His eyes moved from Jacob to Sophie to Ella, still kneeling on the floor. Something ugly flickered across his face. "Mr. Mitchell," he said coldly, "my office. Now." The rumors spread like wildfire. Within days, the entire company was whispering about the CEO and the black employee from the fourth floor. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. Ella's rivals, the ones who had been waiting for a chance to strike, circled like sharks smelling blood. She was given an ultimatum: end all personal contact with Jacob Mitchell or face a vote of no confidence. Meanwhile, Patterson cornered Jacob in the break room. "Who do you think you are?" His voice was low and venomous. "You think you can sleep your way to the top A guy like you?" Jacob's fists clenched at his sides. "It's not like that." "Save it. I don't know what you did to get her attention, but it's over. You're done here. And if you're smart, you'll disappear before you drag that little girl of yours down with you." That night, Jacob found Ella in the parking garage. She was sitting in her car engine off, staring at nothing. He knocked on the window. She unlocked the door. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jacob said the words that had been burning in his chest all day. "I can't do this to Sophie. I can't let her grow up with a father who's the joke of the whole company, a man people whisper about behind his back." Ella's voice was hollow. "So what do you want?" Jacob looked at her, this woman who had somehow broken through every wall he had built, the woman he was falling in love with, the woman he might have to let go. "I don't know," he admitted, "but maybe we should stop before we destroy each other." Ella didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just looked at him with eyes that held the same impossible weight he felt in his own chest. "Maybe you're right," she whispered, but neither of them moved, and neither of them said goodbye. That night, Jacob sat on the edge of Sophie's bed and watched her sleep. Her small chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, her fingers curled around the stuffed elephant Maya had given her on her 4th birthday. She looked so peaceful, so unaware of the storm raging inside her father's heart. He had done the right thing. Walking away from Ella was the responsible choice, the safe choice. He had a daughter to protect, a life to hold together. He couldn't risk everything for a woman he barely knew, no matter how deeply she had reached into the broken parts of him. But knowing he had done the right thing didn't stop the ache in his chest. It didn't stop him from replaying every moment they had shared, every word she had spoken, every time she had looked at him like he was the first person to ever truly see her. He didn't realize he was crying until Sophie's voice cut through the darkness. "Daddy, why are you sad?" He looked down and found her awake, her big brown eyes watching him with concern far beyond her 6 years. He tried to wipe his face, tried to compose himself, but it was too late. "I'm okay, baby girl. Go back to sleep." Sophie sat up and wrapped her small arms around his neck. "Are you crying because you miss Mommy?" Jacob held his daughter tight, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. "I'm crying because I'm scared. Scared of what?" He pulled back and looked at her, this tiny person who depended on him for everything. "I'm scared of letting you down, of making the wrong choices, of not being enough." Sophie's face scrunched up in that serious way it always did when she was thinking hard. "Daddy, you're my superhero. You can't let me down." Something cracked open inside Jacob's chest. He thought about all the years he had spent just surviving, just getting through each day, just holding on. He had convinced himself that survival was enough, that keeping his head down and playing it safe was the best he could hope for. But his daughter didn't see a man who was barely surviving. She saw a hero. and heroes didn't hide from the things that scared them. Across town, Ella sat alone in her father's old office. She had kept it exactly as he left it, down to the fountain pen on the desk, and the photograph of her as a little girl sitting on his shoulders. She picked up the frame and traced her finger across the glass. "Dad, am I allowed to be happy?" The question hung in the empty room unanswered. She thought about her life, about all the years she had spent building walls so high that no one could climb them. She had told herself it was for protection, for survival. But sitting here in the dark, she finally admitted the truth. She wasn't protecting herself. She was hiding, and she was so tired of hiding. The next morning, Ella called an emergency meeting of the board of directors. The conference room filled with gray suits and expectant faces, all of them waiting for her to announce what they assumed was inevitable. She would cut ties with Jacob Mitchell. She would preserve her position. She would choose power over everything else, just as she always had. Ella stood at the head of the table and looked at each of them in turn. Some couldn't meet her eyes. Others stared back with barely concealed triumph, already counting the victory. She took a breath and began to speak. "I have spent my entire life trying to make other people happy, trying to live up to expectations I never asked for, trying to prove that I deserved a seat at this table." Her voice was steady, but there was steel beneath it. "Today I'm done." The room shifted. Confusion rippled through the assembled faces. "You came here expecting me to apologize, to sacrifice my personal life on the altar of corporate politics, to prove that I'm willing to be alone forever as long as it keeps the stock price stable." She placed her hands on the table and leaned forward. "I won't do it." An older board member cleared his throat. "Ms. Bennett, you need to consider the implications." "I have considered them," she interrupted. "I've considered them every single day since I took this chair, and here's what I've realized. You can vote me out. You can take this company from me, but you cannot take my right to love someone who sees me as more than a signature on a contract." She straightened her spine. "If you want to hold a vote of no confidence, go ahead. But I will not apologize for wanting to be human." The silence that followed was deafening. Some board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others studied the table in front of them. And then, slowly, one of the younger members began to nod. Then another. The older man who had challenged her sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair, the fight draining out of him. Ella had called their bluff, and they had folded. At that same moment, Jacob walked through the front doors of the corporate tower. The whispers started immediately. Every eye in the lobby tracked his movement as he crossed the marble floor, but he didn't slow down. He didn't look away. For the first time in his life, he refused to make himself small. He had spent the whole night thinking about what Sophie had said, about being a superhero, about what it meant to truly live instead of just survive. And he had realized something. The safest choice wasn't always the right choice. Sometimes the right choice was terrifying. Sometimes it meant risking everything. He reached the executive floor just as the conference room doors opened. Board members filed out in twos and threes, their faces unreadable. And then he saw her. Ella stood in the doorway, looking more exhausted and more beautiful than he had ever seen her. Their eyes met across the crowded hallway, and the rest of the world fell away. Jacob walked toward her. The whispers grew louder, but he didn't hear them. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough to see the tears she was fighting to hold back. "I didn't come here for a promotion," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I didn't come here for money or status or anything else. I came here because I've spent 2 years running away from anything that made me feel alive, and I'm done running." Ella's breath caught in her throat. "I love you," Jacob continued. "Not the CEO, not the company, just you. The woman who cried in a restaurant because no one remembered her birthday, the woman who asked me to pretend she wasn't important." He reached out and took her hand. "You are the most important thing that's ever happened to me. And if that costs me my job, fine. If it costs me my reputation, fine. But I'm not walking away from you again." For a long moment, Ella didn't move. Then slowly, her fingers tightened around his. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The answer was in her grip, in the tears spilling down her cheeks, in the way she stepped closer until there was no space left between them. 3 months later, Jacob stood in a small workshop on the east side of the city, sanding down a piece of oak that would eventually become a rocking chair. Sawdust covered his clothes and clung to his skin, and his muscles ached in the best possible way. He had left the corporate tower 2 weeks after that day in the hallway. Not because he was fired, but because he had finally given himself permission to chase the dream he had buried when Maya got sick. The woodworking shop was small, just him and one part-time helper, but it was his. Every piece of furniture that left this place carried a part of his soul with it. His mother had cried when he told her about the shop. Not tears of worry like he had expected, but tears of pride. "Your father would have been so proud," she had said. "He always knew you had artist's hands." The bell above the door chimed, and he looked up to see Ella walking in, still wearing her work clothes, but looking lighter than she had in months. Her aunt had called her the week before, demanding to know everything about this mysterious man. For the first time in her life, Ella had talked about someone she loved without feeling like she had to defend herself. Behind Ella, Sophie came running. "Daddy, Miss Nat brought cupcakes." Jacob wiped his hands on his apron and knelt down to catch his daughter as she launched herself at him. Over her shoulder, he watched Ella survey the workshop with that same soft expression she had worn the first time he made her laugh. "The rocking chair's coming along," she said. "It's not done yet." "Nothing ever is." She walked over and kissed him gently. That's what makes it beautiful. Patterson had been quietly transferred to a regional office 2 states away. No announcement, no scandal. Just a memo and an empty desk. Jacob hadn't asked Ella if she had anything to do with it. Some questions were better left unanswered. That evening, they gathered in Jacob's small kitchen. Sophie stood on a step stool, carefully arranging candles on a lopsided cake that she and Jacob had spent all morning baking. The frosting was uneven, and there was more flour on the counter than had probably gone into the batter, but Ella looked at it like it was the most precious thing she had ever seen. "Make a wish, Miss Nat," Sophie commanded. Ella closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were glistening. "This is the first birthday I've ever had," she said quietly, "that I don't want to end." Jacob reached across the table and took her hand. Sophie squeezed between them, wrapping one arm around each adult, binding them together in a way that felt permanent and unbreakable. They weren't a perfect family. They had scars and wounds and years of loneliness that would take time to fully heal. But they were together, and sometimes that was enough. Outside the window, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Jacob thought about the night this had all begun, about a woman crying in a restaurant and asking him to pretend she wasn't important. She had been wrong that night. She was the most important person he had ever met, and the words that had broken his heart, the desperate plea of a lonely woman who just wanted to be seen, had turned out to be the very thing that saved him from a lifetime of merely surviving. Sometimes the thing that breaks you is the same thing that puts you back together.